Coming up next, we are going to continue our conversation about the surprising debate over marriage in Washington, D.C. this week with David Closson, who is the director of the Center for Biblical Worldview. David, welcome to the show.
Hey, great to be with you. Happy Friday, Joseph, and glad we're talking about this issue. It's a critical issue. Bill was introduced Monday, and the House has already passed it, so it's moving fast. So I think it's important for conversations like this to unpack what actually happened and why this is significant.
Yeah, you're right about that. And this is a surprising discussion, and we talked about this on the show already today, but I'll set up our conversation with a couple of these points is that I really think it's good that our political branch is having this conversation, because for the last, arguably 50 years since Roe, most of the policy changes that have happened in America have not happened through our political branches, but through our judicial branch. And with the current Supreme Court majority really reigning in the power of the Supreme Court, the debate has gone over to our political branch again. And I think that itself is progress. But the developments of this week have shown us that there are challenges, because not only did every Democrat vote to repeal the Defense of Marriage Act, but 47 House Republicans did so as well. And David, that has a lot of people wondering, why should we care about this? Okay, the culture has shifted. Polls say that a majority of Americans support same-sex marriage. Love is love. Live and let live, yada, yada, yada. Why should Christians want to relitigate this issue that's just divisive and makes people not like Christians?
Yeah, it's a great question, Joseph, and I think fundamentally this is an issue of truth. The issue of marriage is something that is pre-political. This is an institution that is at the bedrock of society, and it's true. 7 years post-Obergefell, it almost seems like everyone is fine with gay marriage and not. But the truth is, Joseph, when Obergefell was passed in 2015, we were only the 23rd nation out of 195 countries in the world to legalize same-sex marriage. 7 years later, the year's 2022, that number is only 33 countries. Only 33 countries out of 195 have overturned this, millennial, for what we've believed about marriage for 5,000 years. And so although it kind of seems like a settled issue in some parts of American political discourse, we are actually still an outlier when you think about marriage. And so this issue matters, Joseph, because families matter, communities matter, the stabilization of countries matter. This matters because children matter. And of course, as Christians, this matters because having a unbiblical definition of marriage tells us a lie about the relationship between God and His people and His church. So on many levels, this issue matters, as well as the religious liberty angle. I know earlier in the show you talked about religious liberty being threatened by this continuing going down the slippery slope. All of these issues, Joseph, is why this issue matters, which is why people need to be engaged and be engaging with their U.S. senators, because this is going to be coming to the Senate soon, and folks really need to tune in.
That you provide some helpful context there, because out of the 195 nations, only 33 to this point have decided that gender doesn't matter in the institution of marriage and you can marry whoever you want. Now, it's also true that as Christians, we understand that even if all 195 nations had adopted same-sex marriage, it would still be our responsibility to be on God's side of the issue. But I think it's important to understand that globally speaking, it's still a minority position, because there's a lot of people who have not adopted kind of the wokeness of universities in the West when it comes to what men and women are and what marriage is and what the family is. I do think that's important context, but this is happening in a legal context, this debate. There's a lot of people, David, who would say, well, you can't change the biblical definition of marriage legally. There's a difference between what the government says and what the Bible says. So what the Congress or the Supreme Court say has no effect on God's definition of marriage. I agree with God's definition of marriage. I'm just going to be basically indifferent to the legal definition of marriage. What's your response to that?
Yeah, my response to that is the same arguments that a lot of us made in 2015 in the lead up to Obergefell. is that marriage as a pre-political institution, this is the basis for strong civilizations. I think it was Justice Alito in his Obergefell dissent pointed out the fact that for millennia, the reason the state has wanted to be involved in marriage is because they care about children. And what's happened with the redefinition of marriage is that we are prioritizing adult sexual desires, this desire for adult happiness, desires for adult companionship over the legitimate rights and needs of children. Right before the show, Joseph, I actually pulled up the UN Convention on the Rights of Children passed in 1989. And one of the things that the UN said is that children have the right to know and be cared for by his or her parents, whether it's the UN or whether it's ancient cultures that may have been fine with homosexuality. Cultures throughout time and space have recognized that marriage provides that stability that children need to be able to grow up to be functioning and flourishing and healthy adults. So for that reason, I think marriage is a battle that those of us who are conservatives, those of us who are Christians need to engage in, just to realize what's happening. The sexual desires and happiness of adults has supplanted and replaced the well-being of children. And that's a big deal, and that's going to have ramifications generations down the line if we continue to think about marriage in those terms.
That's a really excellent point. In order to accept the premise that relationships involving people of the same sex are in every way the same as relationships involving people of the opposite sex, you have to accept the premise that it's irrelevant for children if they grow up with their biological mother and father. Yeah. And that's a necessary conclusion of the idea that those relationships are in every way the same. But everyone's lived experience and loads of social science demonstrate that it matters if kids know their mother and father, their biological mother and father, and separating them from their parents has an impact on their lives that is not beneficial. Now, David, we've heard the argument this week saying, well, the conservative thing to do is to be supportive of liberty. And being supportive of liberty is supporting people's idea to love and marry whoever they want. Do you think it's important for Christians to try to be conservatives?
I do. I think conservatives ultimately want to conserve or preserve ideas and values and institutions that promote human flourishing. I think we are people who are in favor of liberty, but that's ordered liberty, that we support ideas and values and institutions that are going to bring about ultimate human flourishing. And just briefly, as Christians, Joseph, we affirm marriage as the institution between one man and one woman because that's what God has told us is His idea that will bring about that flourishing for families, communities, and nations. So as conservatives, we should be in favor of a strong marriage culture. And as Christians, we need to support marriage because Genesis 2:24 makes it very clear how God sees marriage, which ultimately reflects His relationship with His people.
Yeah. Conserving anything worth conserving means we conserve the institutions and the ideas that lead to human flourishing. Marriage is the foundation of that. But it's also important for Christians to understand we need to be Christians before we're conservatives. So if we're given a definition of conservative that conflicts with the definition of Christian, we go with Christian. David Closson, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Joseph.